I was unable to recognize her. Says
Tanmay, we are
so.
in live.
We're in live.
Yeah.
No, no,
Am
not
I
yet.
audible? Yeah, yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
perfectly
Yes, you are
audible.
quite audible. Quite.
Yeah. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Yes,
Should we
very
start?
clear.
Yeah,
Should we?
we may.
Yeah.
Sure,
Okay.
sure. Yes.
Hello and welcome to everyone to today's webinar, Special Lecture Series 1. Thinking of the importance of post-colonialism in literature and considering the recent and ongoing crisis in the wake of COVID-19, the Department of English, Rabindra Mahavidyalaya, Champadanga, Hooghly, in collaboration with IQAC of the college, organizes a webinar on Post in the Present, a post-colonial study of history and contemporaneity. My name is Ambalika Biswas and I teach at the Department of English, Rabindra Mahavidyalaya. It is my pleasure to welcome the distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, Honorable Principal Sir, Dr. Prasanta Bhattacharyya, IQSC Coordinator, Professor Tanmay Bandyopadhyay, my colleagues, Bashabi Pal and Shoma Nondi. It is my privilege to introduce the speakers of the session, the honorable and noted guests who humbly agreed to grace our webinar by agreeing to deliver talks on two very interesting and important topics. We have with us Mr. Shaswat Panda, Assistant Professor, North Orissa University, and Dr. Ariktam Chatterjee, Assistant Professor of English at Government General Degree College, Singur. A hearty and warm welcome to both of you on behalf of my department and college. Thank you for being with us. Last but not the least, I would sincerely thank our librarian, Dr. Pranobi Porel, and Dr. Robiul Alam, convener of the IT committee, for the technical assistance to conduct this webinar. I would now request our IQAC coordinator, Professor Tanmay Bandyopadhyay, to speak a few words. Over to you, Tanmay.
Thank you, Madam Ambalika Vishwas, and our respected principal sir, for giving me an opportunity to say something in front of the learned speakers and my beloved students. I, being the IQAC coordinator of the college, always try to engage our students in various learning processes during this period of on lockdown and lockdown days so that they do not get bored. But at the same time, they may upload their faculty with upgraded knowledges. I see this as an opportunity of acquiring more knowledge apart from the knowledge based on course materials only. I sincerely acknowledge my gratitude to our principal and all staff members, students, and especially the speakers, those who engaged themselves today in the webinar for making it a grand success. Now, the topic is totally different from my subject, colonialism. That the topic today is post in the present, a post-colonial study of history and contemporaneity. The speakers, two of the speakers, Dr. Ariktam Chatterjee and Mr. Shaswat Panda, both we are going to listen from them. Now, colonialism is a practice of dominance, which I think we have learned it from our history, and that our countries also suffered a lot during the last 250 years of rule by the British Empire. Post-colonialism is the critical academic study of the cultural legacy of colonialism and the imperialism, focusing on the human consequences of the control and exploitation of colonized people and their lands. More specifically, it is a critical theory analysis of the history, culture, literature, and discourse of imperial power, and usually of the Europeans. Now, colonialism is a practice of dominance which involves the subjugation of one people to another. Colonialism is hard to distinguish it from imperialism, Frequently, the two concepts are treated as synonymous. Both involves political and economic control over a dependent territory. Our country suffered a lot due to the more than 200 years of rule by the British government, and the wealth taken away from our land has enriched the British Empire and made us poor, for which we are still suffering. The impeachment of Warren Hastings in England proved that how our motherland was mm, looted by the British governors. So let us hope for a wonderful discussion on the said topic. And again, thanking you all. I hand over the microphone to our webinar host, um, I think Ambalika. It's Ambalika, I think so. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir. May I now introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Prasanta Bhattacharyya, the principal of our college. He has been an esteemed scholar and an integral part of the English department of our college. His PhD dissertation was on the first wave of English Gothic. He has also taught in the English department of Rabindra Bharati University as a guest teacher for a span of 9 long years. He taught topics like Orientalism to the postgraduate students. So I'm expecting him to give some illuminating talk on postcolonialism. I'm extremely elated, and we as a department feel honored to have Sir with us here today. And I request him to deliver the keynote now. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, my dear hostess, and the other speakers and dignitaries present, including the IQAC coordinator, sir, my HOD, and also Shoma, who has not been visible on screen for some time, and my dear students and those guests of mine who I could manage to inform in this brief time that I got between my job as a principal and my sort of preparation and getting ready for myself for this kind of address. And last but not the least, I'm very happy that it has become a sort of across the institution affair. Uh, Ariktam Chatterjee being a teacher at the Singur Government College and Shaswat Panda, I had this kind of other misplaced or misleading idea about he being one of my students. But I just came to know that he basically, as a kind of a budding scholar and an undergraduate and postgraduate students, he basically belonged to Delhi. Anyway, delivering the keynote address always puts some kind of extra onus on the shoulders of someone who is chosen thus to deliver this. And while talking on post-colonialism, I think with its kind of vast range of things that have already developed and the areas which are also developing as a sort of an ongoing process of the scholars and the teachers and the students' continual engagement with this arena of study, this becomes quite, at least for me, a kind of a daunting task. Initially, I thought of coming up with the very basics of post-colonialism, because primarily we thought in the department, we thought it out in terms of a kind of a presentation that is going to benefit our students, not only within the institution, but those who are students of the outside colleges and maybe of universities or other sort of institutions or academia, the larger academia. Now the thing is, can you see me? Am I visible? Am I visible?
Nah, sir. No, sir.
Just a minute, give me some time. I'm trying to restore it to whatever is normal. Am I visible right now?
No,
Sir, you are audible, but not visible.
Okay. বন্ধ করে দিচ্ছ কিছুতেই নিচ্ছে না, হ্যাং হয়ে।
You are not visible, sir. Hello? Hello?
Am I visible right now?
Yeah. Yes, sir. You are visible. Yes, sir.
Sorry for the technical glitches, but this is not post-colonial, but post-COVID, I think. I'm sorry for the disruption. So back to my own track, we were trying to deliver something on the basics of post-colonialism and post-coloniality, but I just have decided to go against my original plan. And since I have seen that Professor Panda is to present us with the kind of an overview of the post-colonial field, and then there is Professor Chatterjee, who will be more specific and would do with the genre of post-colonial poetry. So I have decided rather to use a kind of contemporary incident which only has recently taken place and use it as a kind of social cultural metaphor so that it can be used as a kind of condensed arena or a condensed kind of a metaphor, as I've already suggested, we should rather bring to the fore the ideas and the concepts which are basically associated with this post-colonial field. I do remember that in preparing the sort of brochure that we have been ultimately managing to come up with, the HOD Bashobi, she has very pertinently used one statement from MacLeod, which suggests that post-colonialism, as we have seen, in part involves the challenges to colonial ways of knowing, writing back in opposition to such views. But colonial ways of knowing still circulate and have agency in the present. Unfortunately, they have not magically disappeared as the empire has declined. So that, in a sense, has given me a kind of a key with which to begin and to proceed further. I do remember Krishnadi, Professor Krishna Sen, who once came over to RBU to deliver her own kind of seminar talk. And there she, for the first time, you see, those were the days when post-colonialism as an idea thinking has only newly arrived. So, and she was suggesting that the hyphenated aspect of post-colonialism must be done away with. And instead of that, post-colonial should be one kind of integral expression which basically points to a sort of a continual way of behaving or interacting or experiencing life as it is lived in our present era or as it was lived in the previous era. And though post-colonialism as an idea of thinking has its own kind of historical or time-bound specificity, it also basically points to a sort of continuity as well. So that basically is a kind of initial prompting which led us to believe and to present the whole idea in terms of the post in the present. So in this keynote address of mine, I would rather try to deal with one very, very contemporary incident that basically has taken place not in India, but in Turkey. But I will come back to my own kind of homegrown example in order to collate these two things and try to put in, if possible, the kind of interlarded meaning or intertextual or intercultural meaning that can be garnered from such a kind of meaningful comparison. The thing is that only recently we have seen in newspapers that Turkey is a kind of country which is for long rather is governed by a very, very powerful man whose name is Recep Tayyip Erdogan. If my pronunciation is right, I mean, this is the way I get him in the newspapers. So Erdogan has come up with this decision and the common decision of his government to reconvert the majestic Hagia Sophia monument in Istanbul into a mosque. And that has led to almost near universal disappointment. Hagia Sophia, built as a church by the Byzantines and converted into a mosque when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, turned into a public museum by none other than Kemal Atatürk in the year, if I remember right, 1934. And now Erdogan is of this view that it will be open for namaz. The Pope has expressed his deep pain at the reconversion. UNESCO as a global agency is also concerned about the diminution of the universal heritage and the values associated with this particular site. And political commentators have seen this as yet another example of the retrograde mindset of the strongman who is known as the president of present Turkey. And please remember that he has been rather a long-serving president of the Turkish land. Now, each of these reservations appear rather well-founded and well-grounded. But to condemn this outright and without understanding the basic impulses that have gone into this effort of at reconversion would be like, falling a prey to the very common impulses that would act as typical grist to the mill. And that unfortunately may lead to some kind of political polarization, which is not the real intent of my present kind of discussion. You see, the driving force behind this reconversion, the latest in a series of Byzantine monuments to be transformed with the help of civil society and also with a strong endorsement from the Turkish judiciary, I would rather say is a calculated move on the part of Erdogan to divert attention from the declining economy of the Turkish country, and also maybe a very kind of strategic way of taking off the attention from the sort of crisis that has set in due to the outbreak of COVID-19. The fact that Hagia Sophia is Turkey's most universal and universally recognized monument, that any reclassification is bound to generate a considerable controversy, make this a plausible inference, I would rather say. But the deeper logic underlying this move, as with some of Erdogan's past actions, has been to expressly repudiate Kemal Atatürk's vision of a modern, secular, and most westernized Turkey. It is this kind of, should I say, disowning of the original vision of Atatürk, this kind of, should I say, doing away with the Western conceptualization of Turkey as a bridge between East and the West, because we all know that how the Turkish land has been originally a part of the Byzantine Empire, and how Byzantium has been considered as a sort of a melting ground where the East and the West met together. So this idea of a bridge between the West and the East are at the heart of this move and its vigorous condemnation. Now, for Atatürk, Turkey could only achieve greatness if it expressly shunned the Islam and adopted a new understanding of a homogeneous Turkish nationhood. Much to the astonishment of Muslims worldwide, and particularly in India, who clamored for restoration of the Caliph after the First World War, Atatürk abolished the institution of the Caliphate itself. He changed the Turkish script to the Latin alphabet. We all know this. And there was an aggressive attempt on his part to remove any trace of traditional Islamic public life. For example, he basically passed the hat law and removed the public act of wearing a fez. That is the average kind of religious practice for a Muslim. We may point out that this was rather a Eurocentric model of secular nationalism, built on simply mimicking the West. And not only was it consciously Western in its trappings, but it was also founded on a Westphalian understanding of a homogeneous nation, or a nation state that was on its way to become stable and would acquire in near future a kind of a prosperity which has been approved of by the Western culture, by the Western political hegemonic ideas. Although its execution was rather bold and I would say, given the time in which people like Kemal Atatürk and Nehru, as our first Prime Minister in India, were working, this was ambitious, but to a great extent successful. Though I must say that there was nothing which is original about it. It was merely an act of imitation on their part, though they have gone on doing it very successfully. Now, in the same vein as Erdogan's assault on Kemalism is that of the present Erdogan attempt on the part of on this aspect of reconverting Hagia Sophia into a mosque. He is basically trying to change the westernized Turkey by resorting to a familiar trope of Islamism. This repudiation is taking shape in two ways in the specific act of converting the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. First, Turkey is expressly affirming its rather Islamic identity, and in some respects similar to other countries of the larger Arabian land, like say Iran and Saudi Arabia, which have already carved out a kind of purely Islamic identity for themselves. And there has been a kind of an assertion that they have done this not because they have been an Islamic country, not despite Islam, but because it is Islam. The assertion is something like that. The second point is this, that in shedding its colonial detritus, the kind of waste that they see in terms of the westernized modernity, it is making a renewed attempt to find something authentically Turkish without borrowing from the West. So this may look pretty post-colonial in its kind of reaction and in its kind of honest attempt at rebuilding the state on the kind of native tradition, ideas and concepts and discursive practices. Now I would try to come to India as a kind of an example which is very open for us. Turkey has never been known as a good friend of India, but we always can draw some sort of parallel between the Turkish country and India in the past or in the present. Jawaharlal Nehru, as I've already mentioned, had been the first prime minister of independent India, and he also, like Ataturk, tried to refashion his own country in the avatar of a westernized nation, which is based on basically secular and democratic principles. Now, in the present state of things, we are seeing a different kind of India. Once again, I say that I'm not presenting this keynote address in terms of any particular bias, but this is my kind of honest and objective analysis of how things are happening in this present world of ours, or how did they really take place in the past, in the long past or in the kind of near past, but how all these things can be seen in terms of the post-colonial developments or the post-colonial ideas that a student of literature who is only newly starting to delve into the very ideas and concepts of post-colonialism are to get for himself or herself. Yes, my point is that by equally disowning the Nehruvian model of modernity and by expressing a new idea of India as a very vigorous and a very strident nation, more powerful than sympathetic, and more conservative rather than rather be modern. And as proof of this new India, we may look at the other kind of very usual, very popular kind of metaphor of the rebuilding of the Ram temple, which is now under construction, but on its way to be built in near future. And here also we are also seeing the judiciary, the Supreme Court of India, coming up with a rather favorable judgment in favor of its rebuilding. Though the other contending religion here, Islam, has been also accommodated by being offered an adjacent site where they can come up with their own sort of sites for prayer and for observation of religious rituals and etc. etc. Now, Nehru and Ataturk did have considerable sway in molding the public opinion during their respective premiership. And they were, as I have already told you, that they were trying to create a very, very modern state that is modeled on the Western notion of a nation. And in India, a sizable majority of the founding fathers of the Indian Constitution, I would rather say, despite fighting 2 centuries of colonial rule, had basically internalized, westernized, I would rather say British attitudes. And that is one reason. Maybe I can be accused of oversimplification that may lead to a kind of an overstatement on my part, but this is how I see the whole thing. The Constitution till this day remains a kind of a document that is drafted by Indians, but which remains colonial in spirit. I repeat, this is not meant to be pejorative, but only descriptive in terms. Now, deliberated and drafted in English, it follows the Anglo-American tradition of creating a modern nation state through a careful division of powers and a guarantee of fundamental rights. To ensure this, it devotes the bulk of its contents to establishing a state apparatus that is primed for ensuring stability. And most of these sections are simply a sort of a carryover of the colonial era government. Like, say, in the Constitution, we do adopt a vision of welfare governance, and this welfare aspect is expressed more in inducting the aspect of the sort of, should I say, directive principles, which basically are like moral strictures without any kind of legal sanction behind them. Now, and in this particular field, the most original of the ideas happen to be the fundamental rights, making the individual of the, or rather granting him or her the basic or accepting him or her as the basic unity, or I shouldn't say unity, the basic unit of a polity. And this, I think, is rather radical. However, in these two familiar tropes of state interests of law and order and stability derogate much from its radical fervor. For example, I do remember in this context Mr. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who had been the leader who was, at the very forefront of India's struggle for independence. He had envisaged this possibility coming to a pass in independent India, where the Indian people would be at the helm of the political or the governmental affairs, but ultimately, in the final analysis, this would remain an English rule, without the Englishman, of course. And he accused of India falling into the trap of becoming an Englistan rather than Hindustan. And he had expressed his concern about this as early as 1908. Now, this development, I would say, am I visible once again and audible? I'm sorry for the
Yes, yes.
kind of disruptions that are taking place. Now, my point is this development did not come as a surprise, since proceedings in the Constituent Assembly were dominated by powerful patricians with varying ideological leanings, but largely, I would say, unified in their view that Western style liberal democracy is the final ideal for India, and that should be given a sort of constitutional validity. And one very important member of that Constituent Assembly, his name being Kengal Hunumantaiah, who ultimately went on to become the governor of Mysore, he regretted once by saying and suggesting that we wanted the music of veena or sitar, but here we have the music of an English band. So it is not something which was not felt even by the original architects of the Indian Constitution and the Indian state. But anyway, this is how things happened for a country like India, like it happened in case of a country like Turkey. Now the point is, just to conclude my kind of argument, I do remember Antonio Gramsci, who had written that the ancient regime must fail or must fall before a new order can be established. Independence or independent movements in India and Turkey established a new order by overthrowing colonial governments, but not colonial governments, I would rather say, but not colonial governance. And the kind of universalist attitudes or stereotypes that are inherent to this kind of a system. The present contemporary governments are basically latching onto a an idea of new sort of native traditions and concepts that tend to rebuild the nation because that they see or present as an unfinished task or business that remain from the very days that the respective nations have acquired their own kind of freedom. And this is a kind of prime timing because there is an idea, and there are reasons for believing in this kind of an idea that the West is basically imploding, and its values are at siege even back at their own home front, in their own home front. In India, as also in Turkey, the ancient regime today is still understood as a colonial one, and demolishing that requires more than the reconversion of a mosque, that is my point, or the reconstruction probably of an awe-inspiring temple in the name of Lord Rama. And I remember also how a secularist like Mahatma Gandhi thought of Rama as a kind of an incarnate, as a kind of a condensed sort of an ideal or a metaphor who basically come to represent his own vision of a tolerant and secular India. But this new Rama is being reinvested with ideas that were foreign to Gandhi's own ideas and principles of governance, or that of a new nation that he thought India would be after it acquires independence. Now, my point is that it is easy to see why some might think of India or Turkey as becoming a post-colonial nation in the truest sense of the term, but there could be others who may think differently. And how this perpetuation basically continues, we may have an idea of by simply citing the case of, George Floyd in recent past. Now, America always takes pride in the fact that it happens to be a kind of a country which regards itself as the vanguard of democracy, in fact, of world democracy, and ensuring the democratic principles includes the aspect of ensuring civil rights. And wherever these civil rights in anywhere of the world, wherever it is being repressed or wherever it is being denied, not only to a community but also to an individual, America would go and would try to establish and hoist the flag of democracy. But in its back in its own home yard, what is happening is very unfortunate, and we understand that this kind of racial difference between the black American and the white American has been historically true. It has got a lot to do with this tradition or aspect of slavery and how this mindset continues even in the present era. And it has been reported in the newspapers and also in popular media how George Floyd, the man who died unfortunately due to asphyxiation, had been pleading with his uh, policeman who nabbed him primarily on the mere suspicion of he being a fraud, who was basically dealing with you know uh, a kind of a currency which is not in proper circulation. So he was pleading with his policeman that it is time to let him go, and for long or more than 8 minutes perhaps, as I have read it in the newspaper articles, he has been put on the ground, and the actual duty of that policeman was to release him immediately. And if the police can be seen as a protector of the same civil rights which are championed by America as a nation, here happens to be a human agent who directly or indirectly can be held responsible for his unfortunate demise. So the point is, post-coloniality is not merely a kind of an idea which can be compartmentalized as a mere historical development that only has taken place after the former colonies acquired their own sort of independence. But it is a sort of continuation, and it has got a lot to do with the discursive aspects of our social and cultural practice. And we have to resort to Foucault and the other kind of thinkers and scholars and teachers who have come up with their very, very interesting insights and learning to make us aware of the rather intricate and, should I say, interdependent aspects of this post-coloniality, which still rule the roost. I mean, we are being governed by a political system which is post-colonial in its intent and in its execution, as we have been governed by a kind of a system which has been like this. So with this, I hope that we could start off, and this keynote address is meant to be only a kind of a starting point, which would lead to the other detailed kind of a discussion. Professor Panda is just waiting to come up with his own kind of an overview of the post-colonial reality or historicity, how it did happen and how it is still affecting us. And in order to remove the social ills, perhaps we need a sort of an counter, or should I say an alternative discourse. I'm just borrowing an idea from the last days of thinking in terms of Foucault, which perhaps could meaningfully do away with this present system of ours. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your wonderful words and valuable input, sir. I'm sure not only our students, but all the listeners will benefit a lot from your lecture. Without much delay, now I would take this opportunity to introduce Mr. Shaswat Panda, who teaches at Orissa University, Orissa. His research interests include life writing, translation, and book history. Thank you for being with us. Today, he'll deliver a talk on empire, history, and identity, an introduction to post-colonialism. I offer my sincere gratitude and warm wishes to you once again and request you to begin with the session.
Thank you, madam, for the introduction. I hope I'm audible and
Yeah.
visible. Thank
Yes,
you.
you're audible and visible. Yeah.
I would like to sincerely thank Rabindra Mahavidyalaya for inviting me to deliver this talk, this lecture. I'm thankful particularly to the to Principal Sir, who I'm thankful to him for several reasons, for setting the tone for today's discussion, for today's conversation. Although I'll be speaking on, I'll be sharing a few thoughts on post-colonialism as some kind of movement, some kind of development in humanities and social sciences. But he has compelled me to think of it by relating it to our contemporary times, by looking at it outside the conventional notions of nation, empire, and so on. So I'm thankful to him. As I'm thankful to him in equal measure for inviting me. I'm thankful to Dr. Basabipal who extended the invitation. So without further ado, I shall begin with my presentation. Okay. Is my screen visible? Could somebody kindly confirm if the screen is visible?
Yes, Professor Shaswat, yes, your screen is visible. You can continue, yes.
Thank you, madam. Thank you. So my talk is titled Introducing Post-Colonialism, Empire, History and Identity. I must begin with a caveat that the three words that I have used in my subtitle, empire, history and identity, are not enough to explain what is post-colonialism. Post-colonialism is much more complex. It's an expansive term, but for the sake of clarity and dare I say simplicity, I have used these three what I believe are fundamental terms to understand what is post-colonialism, because as many of us already know, and as I will try to show in course of my lecture, the idea of post-colonialism, of course, is intricately tied to the idea of empire. It's almost like a given. The two other terms that I have used in the title, history and identity, as we shall see, are equally important, because it's also about his interconnected histories, and it's also about identity. And why just identity? Rather, identities of various people who were involved in this process of who were part of this whole process of colonization, some very deliberately, very assertively, and some who were, let's say, handcuffed to the history of colonization, to slightly misquote Salman Rushdie. What I plan to do in my lecture, the broad objectives, as I have mentioned them here, is to introduce some of the key concepts of post-colonialism, followed by a few of the many well-known thinkers from the post-colonial critical canon, Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, and Homi Bhabha. Of course, I can be accused of being selective, of being selectively forgetful, or there can be hundreds of questions regarding why I have chosen these four. That could be many, but due to for the very practical reason that I must speak within a limited span of time, I have thought of introducing those thinkers whose work in a way gave new directions to the study of post-colonialism. And then, of course, towards the concluding part of my talk, I shall briefly touch upon post-colonialism in contemporary times. I think my job has been made incredibly easy by Principal Sir, who has explained post-colonialism to us in our contemporary terms in our vocabulary by relating it to things that have been happening in India and elsewhere in the world. And I'll end by briefly talking about, and this is what you call thinking aloud, by new directions and possibilities in post-colonialism. What are the possible trajectories that post-colonialism as an academic pursuit could take? So this is my first slide, really. I have chosen to begin by briefly discussing some of the words which one inevitably encounters while talking of post-colonialism or colonialism. So what I thought that before we start discussing post-colonialism, we must first have some sense of what was this whole business of colonialism all about, because post-colonialism follows colonialism. I mean, not just in the sense of a chronology, but in terms of an idea. So we must first know what constitutes colonialism in order to talk about post-colonialism. So here are a few keywords, again, few, not and not necessarily the most defining keywords from the colonial / post-colonial vocabulary. We begin with the idea of empire. So post-colonialism, like I said, begins with colonialism, with colonization. And when you talk of colonization, you talk about the British Empire, you talk about Britain's colonies. So what then is empire? The word empire is taken from the Latin word imperium, which of course is associated with the territories which were ruled by Rome, territories which were not necessarily located in far-flung areas, but territories which had been occupied by Rome through military conquest and several other means. So conventionally, empire is understood as a group of states or countries ruled by a single sovereign, monarchy, and so on, or state. So for example, we have heard of the mighty Roman Empire. All of us have heard of the British Empire. Those of us in India, of course, we know of British Empire, and some of us would also know that Britain itself was once a part of the Roman Empire. It itself was once colonized, but that, of course, is something which is not very often a part of the grand narratives of the grand narrative surrounding Britain. And then, of course, you have things like the Iberian Empire, of Spain, Portugal, and so on, French Empire, and so on and so forth. Then you have what is called a colony, which is a distant territory ruled by another country or political power. So India was a colony, which was a part of the British Empire. And then we come to, say, technical issues, conceptual issues like colonialism and imperialism. So sometimes we use these terms interchangeably. We use one in place of the other as though they mean the same thing. Although these two terms are very closely related, one could say that one is an extension of the other, but there are these thin and subtle differences which we must pay attention to. So imperialism, like I said, imperialism it involves extending power of a country by dominating another country, often characterized by trade and territorial expansion. I have deliberately mentioned trade and territorial expansion because if you look at the history of Europe, particularly the early modern history of Europe, 16th century onwards, Renaissance and after, so Europeans start venturing into other parts of the globe, distant lands. So what became America, the Americas, that is parts of South America and so on. And then, of course, there was India and certainly Africa, and so on and so forth. So it began under the pretext of trade, of business, and so on. But we must not forget that the time around when these expeditions, these so-called expeditions or geographical explorations were taking place and maps were being drawn out or new lands were being discovered, there were also very brutal and violent practices taking place. So, for example, slavery began around the same time when Europe was reveling in the achievements, was basking in the glory of Renaissance. So imperialism begins with trade, territorial expansion, then followed by political and military control. When we come to colonialism, if one were to ask what is colonialism, what is the difference between colonialism and imperialism, I would say colonialism is an extension of imperialism, or to put it in succinct terms, colonialism is imperialism plus settlement. So like I said, trade, territorial expansion, political/military control. So when you have people from a distant land, which distant territory, which takes control over another land, and then start setting up whatever you want to call it, offices, you want to call it, let's say more colloquially, set up shop, business. That's how colonialism begins. And as some of you would already know, that when we talk about colonies and when we look at the history of colonialism, we think of two major kinds of colonies. One is what you call settler colony, the other is what you call occupational colony. Settler colony is the one where the colonizers come and settle, and more often than not by displacing the natives or the indigenous people. Think of Australia, for example, New Zealand, parts of Canada, maybe parts of South Africa. These were settler colonies where they settled, where they stayed back. And then there were occupational colonies like India, where the British did not come and settle down. Of course, they set up offices, built institutions, and so on, but they did not really settle down. They did not displace the indigenous and settle down. But that does not make this kind of colonialism any sweet or anything better or sweet or gentle. It had its own problems. Using people as cannon fodder for one is certainly not a very nice thing to do, even though you haven't really pushed them out of their lands and settled there. Edward Said would say that imperialism is ideology and colonialism is the practice. So it begins at the realm of thoughts. It begins with imperialism and it is followed up by colonialism. You set up offices there. And it has various dimensions. Colonialism could be of various kinds. It's not just about coming and occupying a land or politically ruling a land. That is just the beginning. There is, of course, a very strong economic dimension to colonialism. In India, we are very familiar with what happened to our economy, which was flourishing under Mughal rule. And then the British come and they drain this land. That is, if I rightly recall, a description in Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, the advent, and I think it is also a description you find in Chinua Achebe's novel Things Fall Apart. The advent of colonial rule is compared to the advent of locusts who come and destroy crops. So they've quite literally destroyed our crops. There's no doubt about it. But certainly the economic drain that happened during colonial rule is more or less known to everyone. Then there is a cultural dimension to colonialism. So many people in India think that it was a great thing that the British came and that they taught us wonderful things, gave us the English language, which many cherish as a gift. They gave us railways, they gave us electricity and so on. But what we seem to forget is all this happened at the cost of us thinking of our own languages and cultures as inferior. We internalize what was deliberately fed to us by the British over a period of 150 years or so. Principal Sir did refer to the writing of the Indian Constitution and how it was modeled after the colonial manner of framing constitutions. That is a very clear example of what I'm trying to explain. Then also there is something called psychological colonialism, which I have also hinted at, that you internalize some of the ideas that the British tried to peddle, some of the myths that they tried to circulate. Then you have something called the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is but a community of former colonies of the British Empire and the United Kingdom. The Commonwealth, if one may pardon this expression, the Commonwealth can actually serve as a very good example of what we know as oxymoron. I mean, what can be common and where is the wealth which was drained by one particular country or from several other countries from part of the world, exploited them, and then you put them together and you tell them that once we were all once all of us were together, and it's not as though all of them were equals if they were together, because one had the reins of every other country, so it was never a position of equal. So calling it Commonwealth is also I mean, it's some kind of a misnomer, which is why so many of post-colonial writers, for example, take exception to being associated with this term. So you have something called the Commonwealth literature, or there are expressions like Commonwealth writers. So a lot of writers object to being associated with this term called Commonwealth. I would like to briefly show this painting here. It's a very famous painting by this American painter called John Vanderlyn. It was it was painted in 1847, and it's titled "The Landing of Columbus." And Columbus, as you know, had mistakenly landed in America. He thought it to be India, but it wasn't. And the rest, like they say, is history. So if you look at this picture, it has certain, I mean, it has a few motifs that you associate with colonialism. The figure at the front, the man, the bearded man who's slightly bald, has a flag in his hand as a sign of the place he belongs to, the sovereign he represents, and on whose behalf he has come to conquer this particular land. What you see is he is followed by a bunch of men who have flags in their hands, and you can see sword, which of course is a sign of military conquest. There are spears, and you can see there's also some kind of a skirmish, some kind of a fight going on in the backdrop. So there are a couple of people who are perhaps running for their lives, who are perhaps crawling, who are being attacked. You can see some people, you can see a bunch of naked or semi-naked people hiding behind trees. This, of course, is a representation of the natives, people who belong to that land and people who are at the risk of being colonized. Perhaps there is somebody who is bowing before these conquerors who are perhaps scared. And then you see a cross. So when many of these so-called innocuous expeditions were taking place, and these expeditions would eventually lead to military conquest and would lead to the kind of violence which you can sample from this one painting, and there are several other such paintings and books which tell you a lot about how violent this whole process was, this so-called innocuous expeditions. You can see there is a cross, because much of the colonial project also began with a very zealous and passionate proselytization of the natives, forcing the natives to convert to the religion of the colonizers. If you look at the history of Southern America in particular, if you look at the history of Spanish colonialism, there was a very violent pursuit of making people or forcing people to change religion. And then in the far in the distant background, you can see a couple of ships. So this also tell you about trade, this also tell you about expedition, and so on and so forth. So the reason why I have referred to this one picture is to give you a sense of how colonialism begins. Now I shall come to to those ideas on which this talk is premised, which is empire and identity. So if you look at the history of empire, identity becomes very, very important, in the sense that the colonizing forces, the colonizing powers, always tried to set themselves apart from those they were trying to rule. So, and the whole project of colonization, the way it happened over centuries, you will see there was very often a tendency to define the colonizers as superior and the colonized as inferior. Inferior on several accounts, like I have mentioned here in the third point, on account of religion, on account of culture, race, and so on and so forth. The colonized is often presented as the cultural other of the colonizer. So, to take a very famous example, if you read William Shakespeare's play Antony and Cleopatra, in I think one of the opening scenes, there is a conversation between Enobarbus, who's Antony's close eye, and somebody, and perhaps a soldier in Rome, and the two of them are having a conversation about Enobarbus and Antony's retinue in Egypt, in Alexandria, and the time that they've spent there. And he asks them, "What did you do?" And Enobarbus says that they had a wild time. And one of the things he says, which is hilarious but also very problematic, is he says that we would roast 12 boars for breakfast. So this is just one example whereby Egypt is presented as a contrast to Rome. So Rome represents order, discipline, character, whereas Egypt represents it's just the opposite: complete chaos, lack of any kind of order, anarchic, and there is hardly any discipline, vacillating, represented very prominently by its vacillating queen Cleopatra, and so on and so forth. And yes, the last 2 points, of course, very, very important. We are familiar with the history of colonization in terms of a set of people coming and taking over others' lands, ruling over them, inflicting violence over them, physical violence. But what is equally important is, and this is what you could call the longue durée of colonialism, the long impact of colonialism, not just something that happened for 150 or 200 years, but whose impact lasted and still lasts, is that colonialism tried to very deliberately and very carefully delete, omit, obliterate the histories of the places, the people, the cultures they came to rule over. And they tried to give this impression that these people did not have any history, these people did not have any culture, they were barbarians, savages, and so on and so forth. If you read Mills's History of India, multi-volume History of India, it reeks of such condescending remarks and of course historically erroneous, to say the least. So there was a deliberate project to obliterate the history of those people and tell them that here we are to create knowledge, to bring the light of civilization, as it were, and to enable you, to bring you to elevate you to a position whereby you can write your histories, as though there was no history prior to the advent of colonial rule. Just because there was no history in the written tradition of the West, because it's not as though there was no tradition of writing at all. There were several, there were tomes, there were volumes of written stuff in the colonies as well, but it was a very deliberate attempt, orchestrated attempt nonetheless, to obliterate histories of the people who were colonized and to replace those histories with very flawed, biased, prejudiced history. And there is a long history of that history writing where you have such misguided writings. If you take a look at this famous Nobel laureate who's no more, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, if you read his Nobel speech, he gives you an account of the kind of myths that prevailed around Latin America. So there was the story of El Dorado, supposed to be this mythical place with heaps of gold. And so there was a rush to that place so people could dig up the gold and so on and so forth. And then I come to this point, which is, I think, directly related to most of the people participating in this webinar today, that is students of literature. What role did literature play in shaping the empire? Literature, I would say, served as an ideological tool of the empire. A lot of myth surrounding the empire, a lot of lies surrounding the empire, a lot of lies surrounding the natives, the people who were ruled, who were conquered, who were colonized, was circulated, were peddled through literature. And there is enough scholarship on this you can read. To begin with, I would recommend, of course, Edward Said's Orientalism, Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism, and those who want to very closely focus at what was happening in India, I would recommend Gauri Vishwanath's Masks of Conquests. Now, from these basic ideas surrounding colonialism, basic ideas surrounding the colonial project, excuse me, I would now move towards the critique of the empire. And of course, I will do it in a limited way. Having given a broad overview of the ills of the empire, of imperialism, I would now focus on some of the problems and how we came to critique the empire. And I shall do that by looking at the four thinkers I had referred to at the beginning of my talk. So, like we took a look at some of the terms associated with colonialism, with the empire, we shall now take a look at some of the terms associated with the critique of the empire. We start with anti-imperialism. Anti-imperialism is ideological opposition to colonialism. So the problems of colonialism, those who critique that, those who question that, those who challenge that, can be thought of as anti-imperialist thinkers. And there are several strands of anti-imperialism. It could be through liberalism, it could be feminism, it could be Marxism. And in so many countries, in India, for example, there is a strong conservative strain to anti-imperialist thinking. So a lot of Indian nationalists, for example, are also critical of colonialism, although a historical examination of their involvement in anti-colonial or anti-imperial movement might have a different story to offer, but that's not a part of this discussion, so we won't go into the details of that. Then you have anti-colonialism. Anti-colonialism, the way it is often used, it is used to refer to political struggle against colonialism. And political struggles of all kinds. We need not go into the details. However, I would like to draw a distinction between anti-colonialism and post-colonialism. First, I'll briefly mention this term post-colonialism here, which I have, okay, maybe I should come to it later. But the difference between anti-colonialism and post-colonialism, and I'm drawing from ideas discussed by historian Dipesh Chakravarty in his latest book, Crisis of Civilization, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. And so Dipesh Chakravarty makes this very careful distinction where he says that anti-colonialism is a kind of opposition to colonialism, and that opposition could be a nationalist opposition to colonialism. It's just it's the fight against colonialism, the idea to drive away colonialism. And in that sense, anti-colonialism is itself loaded with a lot of political power. And the conservative strain in anti-colonialism, which I was referring to, is a case in point, for instance. Whereas Dipesh Chakravarty says, post-colonialism, unlike anti-colonialism, does not look at resistance to colonialism or opposition to colonialism in terms of binaries, that you have enemies, you have adversaries that you need to drive out. that you are morally superior to them, that you stand on a moral high ground, they are inferior to you, and so on and so forth. It doesn't work that way. Post-colonialism, Dept Chakravarty would say, understands the many shades of gray that stand between the black and white binaries which anti-colonialism believes in. So Dept Chakravarty says that post-colonialism looks at resistance to colonialism from the margins. The opposition to colonialism, it offers opposition to colonialism not by thinking of the colonizers and the colonized as poles apart, but by looking at what might connect them, by looking at the ambivalences, by looking at the similarities, and so on and so forth. Now, I shall come to post-colonialism. Post-colonialism first as post-colonialism, which it's evident from the expression itself, the term itself, which is that which follows colonialism, right? Literally after colonialism. And this was used by historians with reference to those states which had been freed of colonial rule. So India in the 50s, for example, would be a post-colonial state. Then, more importantly, we need to look at post-colonialism minus the hyphen. Now, this is a very complicated term, a contested term. It's a multivalent term because post-colonialism takes into account not just what happens after colonialism, but it also refers to, like modernity, it refers to certain attitude. It refers to a certain kind of critique of colonialism. It also looks at the effects of colonization, the residue of colonization, the cultural effects I have mentioned in this slide. It also, and this is directly connected to students of literature, it also talks about political reading of literature, especially what was previously called Commonwealth literature, what then later came to be called new literatures. New literatures meaning literature produced from ex-colonies, former colonies, which looked at the past from new angles, from new perspectives, challenged some of the presumptions of colonial rule. So all these things come under the purview of post-colonialism. And then, as a continuing effect of post-colonialism, we might want to very briefly take a look at what is called neocolonialism. Very loosely, we associate neocolonialism with the global hegemonic forces like America and its market imperialism, the way it tries to control economy and so on. This was a term which was coined by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, in his book Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. This was published in 1965. And Nkrumah was drawing on, or he was taking off from where Vladimir Lenin had left in the early decades of the 20th century, because Lenin, as you know, wrote a book called Colonialism as highest form of, Imperialism as the highest form of capitalism. I hope I'm not mistaken. That was the title of Lenin's book. So then he takes off from where Lenin stops and talks about how America ventures into this new kind of colonialism, which he says, and this is how he puts it, American dominance in post-colonial countries through, quote unquote, instruments of indirect controls, which includes monetary systems, things like your IMF, World Bank, corporations, multinational companies, and so on, and several other cultural organizations. So this is neocolonialism, and we shall have the occasion to talk about it a little more. Now what I will do is very quickly take you through some of the major critiques of colonialism, thinkers who taught us to look at colonialism from various aspects, from various perspectives. And I follow a chronological order as I discuss these thinkers. Although there are similarities, there are commonalities, and of course there are differences. So I begin with Frantz Fanon, who was born in a French occupied colony in the West Indies, but whom we more often than not associated with Algeria because of his active participation in the Algerian War for Independence. He was one of the ideologues. Fanon was a Marxist in terms of his political inclination. He was a psychiatrist, he was a psychologist, a radical thinker, has written extensively about colonization, on colonialism. Fanon's crucial intervention in the field of post-colonialism, I would say, is exploring the psychological dimension of colonialism, the impact of colonialism on colonized subject. And he wrote two very important books. The first book that he wrote was a book called Black Skin, White Masks in 1952, where he critiques the internalization of colonial myths by natives, how natives start believing what the colonizers have taught them, that they're inferior, that their culture is inferior, that to look, talk, and walk like the whites would make them smart, would make them superior, to emulate, to ape the culture of the colonizers blindly would make them, or would give them a certain kind of validation in the eyes of their colonial masters. Fanon's second very important intervention, his very important book, which gets published in 1961, is called The Wretched of the Earth. And in Wretched of the Earth, Fanon continues with his psychological exploration of colonial rule. And what this book does, a major contribution of this book to the post-colonial critical canon, is that it expresses very clearly, it articulates very clearly its critique of both colonialism and nationalism. Fanon was somebody who was associated with this movement called Pan-Africanism, which called for Africans to celebrate their identity, Africans across the globe to unite, and to rise beyond narrow considerations of nations. So, for example, a lot of Africans were in America, but they had been subjected to the worst kind of exploitation and torture and violence. They had been made slaves. They were vested with very little rights, forget power. So Fanon was one of those thinkers, and this is in early phase of his career, who believed in this Pan-Africanism, that Africans all across the world should unite and should not think in terms of Americans or English or British or so on, but should think of their identity in terms of their race. So it's a kind of nationalism, if you will, although Fanon would caution us against using this word, which was premised on solidarity of the oppressed. Now, Fanon was not saying that base it simply on the grounds of race. That was a very important part of his politics, but his major idea was expressing solidarity. So he thought that nationalism, which united people in certain way, which brought people together in their opposition to colonial rule, could very well turn them equally prejudiced, equally bigoted, or could could turn them into narrow-minded individuals. So if you look at the history of nationalism, for example, the idea of nation, for example, it's an idea which emerges in, say, late 18th and early 19th century Europe. If you read Ernst Renan's lecture on nationalism, perhaps something called What is Nation or What is Nationalism, he very clearly says that in Europe today, we are witnessing the rise of what is called nation or nationalism, which is that you align yourself along the lines of language, along the lines of religion. You take pride in your affiliation with those with that language or religion. So, for example, nationalism was, let's say, it was a contestation between countries like England and France. England Protestant, France Catholic. England taking a lot of pride in its English language and culture, and France, of course, in French, and so on and so forth. So a lot of these thinkers like Fanon, who were also influenced by Marxism, were very critical of nationalism. So they were not only critical of colonialism, but they were also critical of nationalism, which they thought was a byproduct of colonial rule, which had a model which had been imported from Europe and had the potential of unleashing a lot of negative emotion, a lot of negative energies from the masses, from the people. So this was Fanon. If Frantz Fanon taught us to look at the psychological impact of colonialism, the debilitating impact of colonialism on the psyche of the colonial subjects, Edward Said taught us to look at colonialism, or to look at the machinations of colonialism and the way the sinister projects of colonialism were advanced through their literature, through their academia, and so on and so forth. In 1978, Edward Said, the Palestinian expatriate literary critic scholar living in America, he taught for a long time at Columbia before he died. So Edward Said, he published this book in 1978 known as Orientalism, and Orientalism made some very important interventions in the field of post-colonial inquiry. In fact, a lot of scholars would argue that Edward Said in a way inaugurates this this intellectual movement called post-colonialism in the academia. Although there were several thinkers who predated Said and who had talked about similar ideas, Said's lasting contribution is the way he redefined the study of colonial history and the study of literary criticism, because he was fundamentally a professor of literature. That was his major intervention. So Edward Said talked about the politics of representation, the way the colonizing powers, the way the colonizers very carefully omitted the histories of their colonized subjects, represented them in a very prejudicial manner, represented them in a very selective vocabulary, a vocabulary which reeked of oppression, prejudice, and also violence. So Said would talk about that. The Orient, from which the word Orientalism is derived. So the Orient would loosely refer to the East, but Edward Said would say that this is not necessarily any physically, geographically situated East, but an East which was imagined into existence by colonial writers and thinkers. It was an Orient which they totally created in their text. So that Edward Said would call a textual attitude, that you have a set of writers who traveled to these places or did not even travel to these places. From drawing from their imagination, they wrote all sorts of things, and then they later become authorities. And what they wrote, it was taken as though it was as though Moses was writing on tablets, and those became these writers became authorities on those subjects. So Said would say that colonialism not only inflicted violence through political means, through physical means, but also through knowledge. So he redefined what was previously called knowledge is power by throwing light on knowledge as a tool of oppression. How knowledge could be used to silence people, to omit their history, and to make themselves believe what the colonizer were deceptively talking about them. Of course, what I am saying is not all that is there to be said about Edward Said. There's a lot that remains to be said. And I would urge students particularly to read Orientalism and to read Culture and Imperialism to find out more. Excuse me. We now move to the second major thinker from the list of 4 thinkers we have, which is Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak is a literary critic, a scholar, a philosopher from India who currently teaches at Columbia University. Spivak's contribution to post-colonial thinking is at several levels. She's associated, of course, with post-colonialism, like I said, but she's also associated with what is called Subaltern Studies, with post-colonial feminism, with translation, and with literary theory at large. Spivak's groundbreaking work, which is indispensable for anybody who's trying to understand post-colonialism, is her famous essay called Can the Subaltern Speak? Can the Subaltern Speak has a very important historical, academic history associated with it. So there were a bunch of historians in the 70s and 80s from India and elsewhere who were a part of a project that was called Subaltern Studies. The Subaltern Studies group talked about history from below. That is history which is not written from the perspective of the victors, from the perspective of the colonizers, but those voices which had been marginalized, but those voices who had opposed colonial rule, who might have resisted colonial rule, and so on. So for example, subaltern historians talked about the working class, talked about peasants, and so on and so forth. They, just like Fanon, they also were critical of both colonialism and nationalism. So they challenged the history written by colonizers and the history written by nationalists. Gayatri Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, made a very crucial intervention in also this sense, that it introduced gender as an inextricable part of the subaltern history writing, the subaltern inquiry. So in that essay, she talks about the difficulty or almost the impossibility of the subaltern being able to articulate herself. While she is very critical of colonialism, of colonial rule, she also historians themselves to look at their own endeavor, to think what does it mean to speak for the subaltern, and can the subaltern actually speak for herself. Spivak would then write a very important book called Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, where she would question, where she would challenge and critique Western philosophers like Kant, for example, and she would use this expression called sanctioned ignorance, where she would say that all these thinkers were deliberately quiet about their colonial subjects, that all their scholarly pursuits and endeavor took place very often at the cost of their colonial subjects, and yet they never chose to speak about them. She also used a very important term called strategic essentialism for the purposes of expressing solidarities, that colonial subjects should identify themselves as such in order to build solidarity among themselves. But this was an idea, a concept, which she would refute later. The next thinker and the last thinker among the four pantheon of thinkers that I have in mind is Homi Bhabha. Homi Bhabha's major contribution to post-colonial thinking is his way of looking at the cultural legacy of colonialism. And when I talk about cultural legacy, because when I say legacy, it can be a bit problematic, Bhabha doesn't talk about celebrating colonial culture, but Bhabha says that there is some kind of inevitability regarding the presence of colonial culture in the ex-colonies, in the ex-colonial societies. So he says, if you want to look at colonialism, don't just look at the past or the history, which is what people like Edward Said did, but look at their lasting presence, how aspects of colonial culture continue to breathe, continue to live in current times. So for example, he emphasized the role of language. Think of English, for example, which is still among us, and the role that English plays in India. Very often people take pride in knowledge of English, calling it a global lingua franca and so on. But is it possible to detach this so-called language of aspiration and power from the oppression, from the violence that came with it? So, but these are the complexities that Bhabha explores in his work. And what Bhabha does is, he challenges the binaries that exist. He looks at those gray spaces between the colonizer and the colonized. He looks at the cultural transactions, for example. Bhabha was deeply influenced by post-structuralist thinkers who challenged the idea of binaries, that what is the opposite of something might very well be present in the other object as well. So he looked at these things. Three very important concepts which Bhabha gave to post-colonialism, added to the vocabulary of post-colonialism, I would say, and I will briefly touch upon these. So hybridity, where it talks about cross-cultural exchanges, linguistic, racial, cultural, and so on. So Bhabha talks about, miscegenation, for example, people who belong to both cultures in terms of their biology, their birth, and so on, people who speak the language, people who have cultural affinities. So he talks about people who grow up in the diaspora. Think of the Caribbean, for example. The culture of the natives of Caribbean cannot be thought of by excluding the culture of the colonizers. So he talks about that hybridity. He talks about something called mimicry, very, very important concept. When Bhabha talks about mimicry, he doesn't talk of mimicry simply as some comic artist imitating somebody else. He says that even though mimicry is a way of imitating, of repeating what the colonial masters did, but the consequences could be radically different. It need not always be exactly towing the lines of the colonizers. In fact, it could work to opposite effect. It could mean challenging them. It could mean poking fun at the seriousness of their power. It could be making fun of the gravitas which is associated with colonial rule. Then very importantly, Bhabha talks about what is known as ambivalence, the duality in colonial societies, the love-hate relation between the colonizer and the colonized. And this, he says, could have an unsettling impact on the colonizer. He says that the colonizer and the colonized are caught in a relationship whereby they cannot do without each other. The colonizer, for example, might feel happy at the fact that the colonized subject does what he has instructed him to do. He said the project which Macaulay started, for example, that Indians in flesh and blood, but British in character, having a taste for all things British. So while that might make the colonizer happy that its culture is being followed, it might also be troubling for the colonizer to see how closely the native resembles the colonizer. So any breach of difference, of distinction between the two might be very troubling, might at times be embarrassing for the colonizer. So from this point of view, Bhabha's ambivalence is very, very important. I will now come to last couple of slides before winding up. This slide I have titled is Empire Then and Now. What I wish to draw your attention to, like I said, I'm just thinking aloud, where is the location of the empire? Because you don't exactly have Britain or France or Spain ruling over certain countries in certain parts of the world, but you clearly see a few countries weighing heavy on most of the countries. Think of American imperialism, for example. Globalization is a clear example. The oil wars, America's occupation of Iraq, of Afghanistan, of Syria, Libya, and so on. Think of globalization. And why just America? There are several countries who wish to rise to power, and there are countries in Asia. Think of China, for example, and think of its economic hegemony, for example. It's another example. We also need to think of empire. We need to think of colonialism and its legacy in terms of serious challenges which we are faced with today. For example, questions like migration. Who is a legitimate citizen? Who can be a citizen? Who can afford citizenship? Who cannot? Who's but forced to move out of the country? How does colonialism respond, or how do we look at these questions from or through the lenses of post-colonialism? And then keeping in mind some very serious crises of our times, climate change, large parts of the world being made to pay for the greed and avarice of a few countries. Think of the current pandemic, for example. The WHO recently cautioned against the rise of vaccine nationalism, whereby countries compete against each other for producing vaccine, one trying to sell it to the other, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the ways in which we can think of the empire. Now, lastly, I want to end with this by thinking of the post-colonial pantheon, and I want to look at a few examples from India. There could be many. And again, you will have to forgive me for only referring to three. There are several, but for paucity of time, I have three. M.K. Gandhi, B.R. Ambedkar, and Rabindranath Tagore. I am reminded of Principal Sir's keynote address at the beginning, where he talks about Gandhi cautioning us against following the same colonial model, except by replacing it with Indians. I think he had said English rule without the English. That is Gandhi's press. That was his prescient remark, which rings true even in our times. That even though we have managed to move the British out of India, are we sure that we are not following their exploitative discriminatory practices? Gandhi for that reason. Ambedkar, because post-colonialism also cautions us against narrow-minded nationalism, of not looking at our internal contradictions, internal structures of oppression. We need thinkers like B.R. Ambedkar who talk about social equality. And then I want to end with Tagore. I am indeed honored to be speaking at a webinar organized by a college which bears the great poet and thinker's name. And Tagore, for his idea of imagining a world where people are united through their commitment to ethics, to rise beyond narrow considerations of national binaries. So the humanism of Tagore is, I think, what needs to be incorporated into post-colonial thinking. Gandhi's idea uh, of resisting replication of colonial structures, and Ambedkar's idea of internal critique of social exclusion. I would like to stop with these observations. Thank you so much for your time and patience for listening to me. I'm grateful to English Department, Rabindra Mahavidyalaya, to Principal Sir, and to college. Thank you so much.
Discussing terms like colonialism, imperialism, moved on to psychological colonialism, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, neo-colonialism. You discussed the thinkers, Baba Saheb Spivak, and then ended focusing on the thinkers like Ambedkar and Tagore. That was a wonderfully delivered lecture, I must say. Stay with us. We will now proceed and move on to our next speaker. I would now like to introduce our next speaker for today's session, Dr. Ariktam Chatterjee. Am I audible, Ariktam da?
Yes, you are. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible, right. Okay. I extend a warm welcome to him. He is an assistant professor of English at Government General Degree College, Singur. He did his PhD from the Center for Studies in Social Sciences and his MPhil from Delhi University. He has published academic articles in national and international level journals and book chapters in edited publications. He has also authored 2 books. One is a collection of translated Kannada vachanas. Apart from English and Bengali, he is conversant in Sanskrit, Hindi, and Urdu. His areas of specialization include translation studies, semiotics, Renaissance studies. His recent interest is the theoretical development of Indian thoughts on translation. He is also a guest teacher in the Department of Comparative Indian Language and Literature in the University of Calcutta. He also practices music in free time. Today, he'll speak on an overview of post-colonial poetry. Welcome, sir. We are very happy to have you with us in this virtual platform. Over to you, Ariktam da.
Thank you, Ambedkar, for the very kind introduction. I would like to take this opportunity to extend my sincerest regards and thankfulness to your college, to the principal, whom I have known for a long time as a senior colleague, and to the chairperson of the coordinator of the IQAC, and everyone in the department. Thank you so much for inviting me to deliver this lecture. Uh, as it is understandable that I will take a slightly detour from what has been spoken till now, because we will be dealing with something which is slightly different, and that is poetry. I'll just take a minute to begin this. Right. Okay. Now I will begin my deliberation with a quote from Natya Shastra. in the sixth section of his book, Bharat says, Nahi rasadrite kaschit artha pravartate, which means that when I'm talking of some creative activity, like writing of poetry, then its entire meaning is encapsulated in the expression of the creation of rasa. What is rasa is a different question. We do not want to get into it over here. But what I want to get into more is into the second part, which is artha pravartate, meaning. Now, Nyaya Darshana would tell us that pramane arthama pravritti. So, in order to understand meaning, we need a certain sense of pramanas through which meaning is created. Now, when we come to understanding meaning in poetry, then certain things changes. It has its own kind of relationship with meaningfulness. For example, Abhinavagupta, who was a Shaiva Tantric philosopher, writing much later in a book called Dharnyanakalochana, would argue out the position of meaning when I'm writing in poetry. Where does meaning reside in poetry? Is it in the poem? Is it in the mind of the listener of the poem? Is it somewhere in between these two that the meaning is somewhere residing? And in poetry, this meaning, as the very word rasa, which means which of the different meanings of the 42 different meanings that it has, also means sap, of a tree inside a branch, which means there is a degree of fluidity in it. It cannot be confined to one particular set of meaning making. In the early part of the 20th century, we know that some of the formalist theoreticians were also involved in the job of isolating meaning in poetic utterance. Of all the people who worked within that the Russian group of formalists, Jacobson was perhaps the most prolific, and he also thought highly about the position of poetry in meaning in poetry. And he has 6 different sets of communication in which deliberation, denotative meaning, for example, when I am saying something and my listener is hearing it, and the meaning is transported from its entire semantic economy, from me to the listener, is on one side of the pole, and poetic utterance is in the completely opposite side of the pole. We know that the formalists talked about defamiliarization in poetry. When I talk of poetry, I take things which are very familiar to me, but present them in a way which becomes unfamiliar, which is very similar to what Abhinavagupta is saying in Tantra Lok, that if I talk of things that none of us know of, then there will be no rasa nishpatti. Nobody will get any pleasure out of that poem. And if I'm talking everything in a familiar way, then also the rasa, the aesthetic pleasure that we derive from the poetry will not emerge. Working on these parameters, very recently, we have been talking a lot about, we're listening to excellent lecture on post-colonial theory, first by the Honorable Principal and then by Shaswat, who is an excellent young scholar. Now, we all realize that theory very recently has taken a kind of spatial turn. It's moving towards considering everything in a kind of spatial metaphor. And the move towards that actually started, perhaps was foreshadowed by the post-colonial thinkers because of the insistent spatial metaphor that they indulged in. Very recently, perhaps in the last 20 years or so, a new branch of semiotics is developing in Estonia, in Turkey, with Juri Lotman as its leading thinker. He is thinking about natural language and poetic language in the sense he's stating that in natural language is on one side of the pole when I am saying something and the listener is saying something in a kind of classical code transfer kind of a model. For example, if you ask me what is my name and I presume that you don't know me and I tell you that my name is Ariktam, then this information passes within a kind of shared code, which is the English language, from me in its entirety to you. And on the completely different side, there is auto communication, which happens in poetry. When I, as the speaker, as the giver of the message, and you, as the listener of the message, collapse. I become both the speaker and the listener of the message, which is completely embedded or embodied within me. Then why am I speaking at all? Which means that there is something that is happening in poetic language which cannot be stated as such, which cannot be circumvented, but which is a kind of a completely separate and independent code system. Now, I want to say all these things. The way I took this detour before entering in the topic is that it is always difficult to talk about poetry within as a subset, within a kind of theoretical premise that we take as a given. So although I am talking of post-colonial poetry, we have to understand that there are positions of overlaps, but poetry is poetry, and post-coloniality in its own way has an independent life, although there are points of coming together. Nobody is meant to be subservient to the other. That kind of clarifies a lot of what I'm going to talk about, and it perhaps in a way does justice to both of these, the post-colonial part of it as well as the poetic part of it. I will speak about two poems today. Why I chose them is perhaps the easiest to state. Usually we find that stating the reason of choice is the most difficult part of creating some kind of an academic presentation. Like Shaswat said that the reasons why he chose four theorists out of many can be questioned, and he probably has his set of answers. My reason is very simple. These are for the students, and these are in their syllabus. So that is a kind of very practical kind of reason I have for this. Of the 4 points that they have, I will speak on two. And now, what happens when I'm talking of poetry, and when I shift from everything that has been said before to this, is that I can put it in this way, that what I will try to do is that I will take some kind of an epistemic structure, a kind of epistemological structure of post-coloniality as a kind of site of negotiation, and give it a kind of ontological turn. So if I can put it in a different way, if I can reword it, what I'm trying to do is that I will shift this entire movement from being a study of post-colonial condition of being to largely a study of being that is being operative amidst a condition of post-coloniality. So I think that is the way in which I will approach my poems. I am very thankful that most of the things that have been said before will be in direct relation to what I will state over here, and the students particularly and all the listeners can draw very easy parallels between the two if they want to. However, poetry being a kind of polysemic utterance, there are also moments of translucency, if I can borrow Jacobson's word, and so they are free to think otherwise as well. Okay, now this is the first poem that I'm going to talk about. It's called this poem is called A Far Cry from Africa, and it is by Derek Walcott. Now, Derek Walcott uh, was a West Indian, he was a poet, he was a novelist, he was a dramatist, he was a teacher, he won the Nobel, he was a Nobel laureate, and now, when we come to Walcott, when we talk about Walcott, um, see something that happened with post-coloniality, despite everything, the entire narrative of hostility that happened. It is possible to look at this entire negotiation between the two binaries as a creative space as well. Uh, Post-colonialism or the post-colonial condition did enable a great degree of movement as well, resulting into hybridity, as Shaswat said. And this hybridity, as well as mimicry, as we will soon see, can be transposed or translated creatively through the mediative operation of art. Uh, so that is something that we will try to see how. Since I do not have much time, I believe I will very fast move on to the poem itself. Right? Uh, Let us first take a look at the title of the poem. Although it is not written here, it's called A Far Cry from Africa. Now, if we concentrate on the title of the poem, we will see that a multiplicity of meanings have been woven within the structure of the title. Walcott is writing from St. Lucia in the West Indies. If we talk about his individual life, he is an individual with a mixed kind of a parentage. Half of his grandparents were white from his father's side, and half of them were black from his mother's side. So he has inherited both both uh, both traditions and both ancestry within him, which puts him in a kind of a liminal subjective space that makes him uh, that makes the situation, the observing of the post-colonial condition, both easy and difficult for him in two different ways. The way it becomes somewhat relevant for him is the way that he is not bound to take a side, and he can look at it with a degree of objectivity. The difficulty comes at a different level. The difficulty comes at a level that being an West Indian and being a critic of the colonial endeavor, he has no other way but to use English as his language of expression. This is something that we repeatedly find in many post-colonial authors, poets, particularly in the West Indies, which itself has a very troubled history of being kind of handed over from the British to the French and back and back. So there are lots of French usage too that come in within the West Indian parlance. Walcott kind of talks of everything, and it is from that subject position that he is talking about Africa. So a far cry as a phrase can be first of all physically used. Africa is very far from his physically. I mean, he has to travel a lot to go to Africa. You know? So that is one way of stating far. And then the far cry, we also know that it has a kind of idiomatic usage. It means something that is close to impossible. You know, it's a far cry. It means something that never can be achieved, in a sense. Uh, Now, if we have a kind of use of this word from the preposition of India, then we have that it is coming from Africa. Right? Which Africa is here being spoken of? Is the place that Walcott is residing in West Indies, very far from the continent of Africa? That is perhaps the most apparent literal meaning. Or is it that the kind of African past that he has inherited is something to which he can never go back because of the hybridity that in between and is therefore a far cry? Or is it that the Africa, the colonized Africa, Africa that is fighting relentlessly to free itself from the shackles of colonization, is a far cry from the pristine Africa that has been pictured and presented Perhaps a part of it is true, but mostly as a construction, as an othering of the mechanized, civilized Europe. We cannot forget the fact that a great degree of exotization, of turning into exotic, of the past of non-European sites of knowledge construction was also part of the Orientalist project. Uh, so is that Africa, the ancient old Africa, the pure Africa, which perhaps existed, perhaps never existed, because purity is one of the biggest constructs in which this entire colonial discourse often engaged in to reconstruct its sites of colonial dominance, a far cry from the Africa that he's talking about, where rampant violence is taking place. The place that he's particularly referring to in this poem is Kenya. See, in Kenya, what happened is that in 1952, there was something which came to be known later on as the Mao Mao Revolution. A group of armed rebels who went by the name of KLFA, Kenya Land and Freedom Army, revolted against British occupation. And what they did was that they attacked the British quarters, and there was rampant violence, and a white child was killed. So soon, the British colonial power unleashed their army, which went back and killed members of the KLFA in hundreds, which turned this entire Kenya's fight for freedom into a very violent kind of an outcast. It is this incident that Walcott is using as his point of departure in the poem that we are going to read. So let us get into the poem right away. I will read it first. Imagine uh, the way Africa is represented, let's say, in the kind of National Geographic type of representation, right? It's a kind of it's a grassland, where the wind is blowing gently over the yellow or the green grass that is there over the belt or the extended grassland, and there is a river that is going in between, where animals of all kind, তাই তো জেব্রা জিরাফ সবাই জল খেতে আসে, যেভাবে আফ্রিকা আমাদেরকে দেখানো হয় ন্যাশনাল জিওগ্রাফিকে এইভাবেই আফ্রিকাকে দেখানো হয়ে থাকে. So what Walcott is doing over here, he is using that premise, he is using that construct in order to challenge it later. Take a look at the very first line. It's almost a kind of cinematic technique that is employed over here. A wind is ruffling the tawny pelt of Africa. Africa itself is being personified as an animal. A wind is ruffling the tawny pelt of Africa. Pelt, as we know, is the fur, the skin of an animal. Tawny is the color, the reference to the color. Throughout the poem, we will find that there is this kind of juxtaposition of opposing colors to bring out the motif of binaries. So if we take a look at the word tawny in the first line and the word white in the second last line, we will find that there is a kind of antinomy that is being created within the structure of the poem itself. A wind is ruffling the tawny pelt of Africa. Kikuyu, quick as flies, batten upon the blood streams of the belt. Kikuyu is the name of the tribe. It's the most dominant tribe of Kenya. And they were the people who were at the forefront of the Mao Mao Revolution and also at the receiving end of the most of the violence that was unleashed. So Kikuyu's batten would have two meanings. One is, of course, to go and gorge on something, and the other is bitten, to be battered. So there is a kind of dual meaning that is being worked out. They were the one who have been bloodthirsty, and they have been the people who have been tortured upon, who have been killed. Kikuyu, quick as flies, is again a kind of reference, as we know, to King Lear of Shakespeare, where we are as flies to nature who kill us for their sport. So the colonial power is almost appropriating itself in the role of destiny, killing the Kikuyu people who are as helpless as flies are in the hands of children. Kikuyu, quick as flies, batten upon the bloodstreams of the veldt. Veldt is the grassland. Corpses are scattered through a paradise. See, we will find an example of paradox over here. Antithesis with corpse and paradise challenging each other within the very line. So the paradise of Africa, that is a construct, is being challenged by the reality of Africa, which is strewn with corpses. Only the worm, cornel of carrion, cries, waste no compassion of this several dead. We have the animal imagery continuing. The worm is the kernel of carrion. You know what, we all know what carrion is. Right? Carrion are birds and animals who eat the dead. Worm is the best of them, who make no distinction between the people who are dead, but use them as their fodder. So only nature knows that all these dead people will die and go back to their land without any identity. It makes no separate meaning or comes with no significance. Two, the bigger picture of nature on which they lie dead. This can be one meaning. A second, more embedded meaning would be can be read in the application of the word cornel itself, which is, as we know, a position within the British military. So, the cruelty of the worm who makes no distinction of the dead is being directly related to the cruelty of the violence which the colonial power can unleash to consolidate its power on the colonized side. And then, of course, we have the justification of the action. Statistics justify, and scholars sees the salience of colonial policy. After the introduction that Principal Sir gave, I think it will not be very difficult for us to understand how statistics justify and scholars sees the meaning of this, the salience of colonial policy. But all these things, the way the scholars and the statistics jump in to justify and validate and in a way certify even the most heinous of governmental policies, what is that to the white child hacked in bed? This was the incident I was referring to. What of that? Does violence, and Shaswat spoke of Fanon, and Fanon has this entire discourse on the violence and the kind of binary nature, which, and we know that the freedom movement in Africa, in Algeria, Kenya, were of an extremely violent nature on both sides. Violence was unleashed. Now, what can justify the death of a white child hacked in bed? What was the fault of that child? To savages, expendable as Jews? Now, this is again a kind of very loaded meaning to which we can come. Is this use of the word Jews? I will not get into much of it, but I will refer to two incidents. The most automatic kind of a reference that comes to mind is that the Jews, the violence that was unleashed on the Jews by the Nazis, so that the Holocaust, that is the most immediate image that comes. But I will give you another reference. সাবিত্রী চট্টোপাধ্যায়কে আমরা অনেকেই চিনি, প্রখ্যাত অভিনেত্রী। তিনি প্রথম যে ছবিতে অভিনয় করেছিলেন সেটার নাম হচ্ছে নতুন ইহুদি, এবং তিনি সেটায় চান্স পেয়েছিলেন মূলত এই কারণে যে তিনি খুব ভালো পূর্ববঙ্গীয় ভাষায় কথা বলতে পারতেন। ফলে উদ্বাস্তু যারা, তাদের সঙ্গে, যারা গৃহহীন, তাদের সঙ্গে, যেহেতু ইহুদিরা দীর্ঘদিন after their flight from Egypt moved around in the desert having a home of their own, were comparable. So the Jews were often equated with migrant identity. এবার one thing that the colonial condition instilled is that it gave rise to a high degree of migrancy. People started to move around a lot, creating a new kind of cosmopolitanism, a new kind of cosmopolitan identity. And the Jewishness has often been used as a trope for that. So although there is a kind of direct meaning of Jews being expendable in the form of Holocaust, there is a secondary layering of meaning of Jewish being a metaphor for the homelessness, going somewhere, building its home, and creating a new land where to stay and celebrate that identity, where home always reappears as a kind of metaphoric space, which again relates us to Walcott's own subject position, where Africa almost always recurs as a kind of expendable, as a kind of metaphorical space for home. The next stanza is a description of a hunt. Threshed out by beetles, the long rushes break in a wide dust of ibises whose cries have wailed since civilization's dawn from the parched river of beast teeming plain. This is an image of African tribes going out for their hunting, beating their drums, and ibis, which is a bird, we all know. Whenever a hunt party comes out, the first to take flight from the grassland are the ibises. They go, and in a way they also let out a cry which warn the other animals that something is there. Will I call this violence? Shall I call this violence? Tribes beating their drums and going out to hunt animals. It's killing something, right? In a beast teeming plain, a plain that is teeming with beasts. So they go out and they hunt buffaloes perhaps. And the use of the word civilization is very interesting over here, because it is used in reference to Africa. And if we go back to what Shaswat said, civilization was one of the most key points on which the Western European powers carried out their othering of the Orient. The violence of beast on beast is read as natural law. These tribes have been sustaining themselves by hunting for a long time. It is only the so-called civilized Europe that has come and constructed that as violence. No one really read it as violence. Everyone read it as a kind of natural law. But here the poet is kind of inverting that paradigm to state that the violence is natural. But upright man seeks his divinity by inflicting pain. This can be a reference to the missionaries who came hand in hand with the colonialists to spread civilization and the word. Now civilization and Christianity has been going hand in hand throughout the colonial endeavor. And we know that often the preaching of Christianity to the so-called darkened constituencies of the world has been a justification of colonization. So that pain, that violence have been justified by divinity. But something that was natural has been dubbed as violent. And it is this particular construction which has been inverted by, the, by the poem itself. Delirious as these worried beasts, his words dance to the tightened circles of a drum, while he calls courage still that native dread of the white peace contracted by the dead. So what is saying, what Walcott is saying over here largely is that um, the hunter is now being hunted through the same logic which has been used as a source of sustenance through a complete inversion of the logic of violence. Right. So we go to the final stanza of the poem, which states,
Ariktam, can you hear me? The connection, it seems like that the connection has been lost.
hello, am I audible now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah,
Yes.
I just got disconnected for a while.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Yeah.
Okay. I'll just carry on from where I left. Right. So now we come to the final stanza of the poem. Again, brutish necessity wipes its hands upon the napkin of a dirty cause. Again, a waste of our compassion, as with spade. The napkin is white, the cause is dirty. The cause is the kind of colonial dominance which is engaging in violence. The napkin is the kind of civilization justification of this entire endeavor. And again, a waste of our compassion. Waste of our compassion would mean the compassion that we have for the rebels who are being relentlessly killed is falling into deaf ear, as with Spain is a kind of slightly off the context reference to the freedom movement, to the kind of to the kind of struggle that was happening in Spain again towards the early part of the 20th century. But let's come to the next line, which is more pertinent to the cause, which is the gorilla wrestles with the Superman. Now we know that these are two extremes of representation that has been brought in over here. The gorilla as the archetypal representation of an African, as something as something which is primal, primitive, a primate, literally. And the Superman is, of course, the great endeavor of the European. So these are the two extremes that are locked in fight with one another. And now we come to the poet's own words, from his very own sense of being. I who am poisoned with the blood of both. This is what I meant when I was speaking about how to take a position which is perhaps structurally somewhat hostile and turn it towards a more creative kind of an expression. What position will the poet take now? Where shall I turn? Divided to the vein, because he has a mixed ancestry. Half of his parentage comes from Africa, half from Europe. Where shall I turn? Divided to the vein, I who have cursed the drunken officer of the British rule, I who have criticized the unsympathetic, cruel nature of the colonial project and the way it is being played out, the way the violence is being unleashed on the sides of colonization. How choose between this Africa and the English tongue I love? English is the language I know and the English is the language I love. How will I choose between the two? Betray them both or give back what they gave? You can relate it directly to the question of mimicry that Shaswat raised in his previous lecture. English is the group he is talking about, yet English is the only tongue that he has, and he not only has, it is the language in which he is trained, it is the language he writes in, it is the language he loves. If he uses this language against the English dominion, is it an act of betrayal? And if he, being an African, uses English as his preferred mode of expression, is he betraying the Africans then? Or, and here he is talking about the creative possibility of his liminal condition, give back what they give. Give back what they give can be used. Shall I use the English language itself and apply it against the English people? Use it as a form of subversion, which is an embedded part of all mimicry? Or does it mean that I will give back to Africa what they expect from me, what I, as a part of responsibility and duty, should give back to them? Using my agency to establish their voice vis-a-vis the voice of the colonizers. How can I face such slaughter and be cool? Slaughter on both sides. How can I turn from Africa and live? So it begins, it ends with a set of very rhetorical questions, the answers to which he is partially answering. Now, if I go back to the beginning of what I was talking about, of poetry being a kind of auto-communication, these are questions which is both asking the reader and also asking himself. Or he is using the reader as a kind of a decoy to actually point the answer towards himself and ask, how can I turn from Africa and live? Is it possible for me, though I have I was not born there, I have never lived there. Yet I cannot really deny that part of Africa which is very much within me as an ontology. It is as much a part of my life as the English language is. And without either of them, I don't be what I am. So it is both a cry of helplessness, but at the same time, it is also a kind of celebration of this hybrid identity that he inherited, which gives him an agency to speak out against the act of colonial violence. Okay, so I think I will just stop with this poem here, and now we will move to a completely different kind of a poem, which is also a part of the syllabus, and yeah, this is a poem by Mamang Dai, and he was born in 1957. She is from Arunachal Pradesh, and the poem is called this, Small Towns and the River. It is also part of the syllabus that is prescribed. She belongs to this tribe, the Adi tribe of Arunachal Pradesh. See, one way in which the metaphor of colonization may work, the post-coloniality can work, if we kind of shift the focus from the actual encounter of colonization to a more truthfully post-colonial condition, then it can be used as a kind of writing back not only of the previously colonial sites to the empire, but also marginalized sites to the center. And I think that kind of in a kind of larger, broader way justifies the inclusion of Mamang Dai within the corpus of post-colonial writing. Okay, but I think we will just stop harping on that, and we will go back to the poem in itself. Now, the Adi tribe of Arunachal Pradesh has a kind of myth system, which is very different uh, from either the myth system of mainstream Hinduism that we follow, or Christianity, or a kind of myths, or a kind of mythological kind of ethos that has developed out of a transaction between the two. It is largely animist in nature, which consider the mountain as a living entity. I think it will not be very out of place over here to say that one of the points on which othering took place in many of the early, if we go back to the colonial archive, we will see that how many of the colonized nations were often represented as having a more nature-oriented kind of civilizational orientation as compared to the more mechanized Europe. It has also been exoticized to a degree. For example, the myth of, we find it in Rousseau, for example. We find it in the creation of the myth of the noble savage. But despite this kind of turning into the exotic, there has been a structural domination of the mechanized, the industrial civilization over something that is natural, which kind of gets re-inscribed within the nature-nurture debate later on. And in the post-colonial time, it will not be, I think, very out of place to state that we have inherited a part of that thinking. Mamang Dai speaks from a position where human being and the environment which human being inhabits are not seen as completely different entities, but are integrally linked to one another. They're locked. It's a kind of continuity. It is something that was there long before in Europe as well, before the famous or infamous, shall I call it, Cartesian division came about, which created the man as a kind of transcendental being as divorced from the environment that he inhabits, leading into all kinds of enlightenment premises, which was one of the major philosophical justification of the colonial project, into going back to a tribe, into going back to a group of people in which this division is not believed in, by and large. So the mountain among the Adi tribe is a living entity. It, it is where it is inhabited by ancestors. It has a mind of its own. It reacts, and it reacts in a way in which human beings react. So if we understand the language of the mountain, if we are in tune with that kind of science structure, which we have perhaps steadily forgotten over the period of last 200 years through our valorization of human language, then we will be able to read what it says. It is not an inert object to be inhabited and exploited if possible. So we will just read the poem. Small towns always remind me of death. My hometown lies calmly amidst the trees. It is always the same in summer or winter, with the dust flying or the wind howling down the gorge. So we already find the poet locating herself and her small town in two ways. First, it is being located very clearly within a kind of rural atmosphere, and secondly, it is being noted or presented as something that is as eternal as nature. It is always the same. It never changes. Just the other day, someone died, which can justify the first sentence, small towns always remind me of death. In the dreadful silence, we wept, looking at the sad wreath of tuberoses. মারা মারা গেলে পরে যেরকম রজনীগন্ধা ফুল দেওয়া হয়, সেরকম রজনীগন্ধার ফুল দিয়ে মৃতকে সাজানো হয়েছে। And we wept in dreadful silence. And in this small town, death keeps happening. But that death never changes anything. Because these tribes are well attuned with an understanding of the transitory of life and death. Life and death, life and death keeps happening. What remains are the rituals. Only the rituals are permanent. So human being, from its high transcendental position as vouched by the entire Enlightenment project and later carried on by a kind of liberal thinking with its base in humanism, is somehow being subverted to a deeper understanding of life, where it is seen invariably as something that is subservient to something more permanent, which are the rituals. So human beings are basically the carriers of these rituals. See, there is a kind of linguistic analogy that can be drawn out of here. কলিমালি বলে একজন লেখক আছেন, তিনি পরমা ভাষার সন্ধানে বলে একটি বই লিখেছেন। তো সেখানে উনি দেখিয়েছেন যে if you take a look at the Sanskrit language, আমরা যদি সংস্কৃত ভাষাকে দেখি, আমরা সেখানে একটা অদ্ভুত জিনিস পাই, সেটা হচ্ছে ধাতু, which is a kind of small stem, a small root from which we put the stem and the tree of a word grows. And if we kind of take a look at these words, we will find that they emerge from verbs. For example, cow mane go. Amra shobai jani. Go, this word actually comes from গমন, এক জায়গা থেকে আরেক জায়গায় যাওয়া। ফলে যে গমন যে গমন করে সে গো। পরে তার অসংখ্য ভাষা, অসংখ্য অর্থ থেকে নির্বাচিত হয়ে একটা মানে তার মোটামুটি ফিক্সড হয়ে গেছে, which is cow. Why has this happened? This has happened, what Kolimali is showing is that with the emergence of a more market-oriented kind of an economy and moving towards private property, fixing of meaning becomes important. So the ancient Sanskrit grammar of the Vedas changes into a later grammar with which we are familiar. For example, if I say that Ariktam is speaking rubbish, then Ariktam is the subject who is speaking whatever he is speaking, right? But in ancient Sanskrit grammar, and which perhaps can be extended to a very early hypothetical Indo-European group of language, which you don't know, except through hypothesis whether it existed or not, it would be that whatever is being spoken by Ariktam. So the subject is not carrying out the act, but the act is the primary thing which is being carried out by the subject. So there is a kind of valorization of the subject. From here we come to a position where the self becomes very significant. But if we take a look at places, at sites where this kind of later intrusion has not happened so readily, their life is still, mankind is still seen as someone who is a carrier of something more permanent that is being carried on. So only the rituals are permanent. Life, death, individual life, my own thinking is always subservient to something that is more transcendental, which is the rituals themselves, the nature, the mountain. We will go to the last. The river has a soul. So the river is not an inert object, it has a soul. And remember, when someone like Dai is saying the river has a soul, she is not merely personifying the river as a human being with a soul. It's not like that. It is an integral belief that the river is an entity with a soul, because it is carrying out an act, and an act of predication. In the summer, it cuts through the land like a torrent of grief. Sometimes, I think it holds its breath, seeking a land of fish and stars. So the river has a kind of consciousness over here. And the river takes the fish to the mountain as a kind of offering. The river is if I'll just read the two stanzas together, it will be easier to explain. The river has a soul. It knows, stretching past the town, from the first drop of rain to dry earth and mountain top, the river knows the immortality of water. So what the image, this kind of grand panoramic image that is being used over here is that the river has water. In summer, that water is being evaporated and it is falling in the form of precipitation on the mountain. And this mistiness of the mountain is giving life to the mountain itself as something that can be felt but never be known. So the river and the mountain are carrying on a conversation. There is a kind of direct conversation, a kind of natural language that is being used within them, which we can witness, provided we can look beyond the kind of natural semiotic of human language that we believe in, and take a look at the most indexical and iconic kind of a language patterns in which nature indulges in. So the river very consciously moves through the land. Okay, like a torrent of grief is a reference to the flood. Sometimes it holds it when seeking a land of fish and stars would mean, one of the many meanings that it would have is the fish is this world, because the fish is both taken to the mountain by the Adi tribe in the form of an offering, and it is also something that people feed on, and stars is the world beyond. So the river is a kind of connection between this world and the other world, the world to which people go after their death, the death that has been spoken about in the previous stanza. So the river is actually permanent. It, through the ritual, is connecting the life with the death. Okay, and through its water is giving a kind of immortality to the soul, to the departed soul. A shrine of happy pictures marks the days of childhood. Small towns grow with anxiety for the future. You can compare this with the uh, kind of pattern trope that Shaswat has been talking about when he spoke of things fall apart, of a particular paradise that is being disturbed through a kind of intrusion of colonization. So we can understand that what Dai is referring is this kind of continuity that was there in the older sites have somehow been disturbed with the coming of a more urban ways of thinking, or maybe she herself has been displaced from this, and this childhood is coming in a form of memory, and there is growing anxiety that this understanding of continuity or immortality will be uh, stopped. There will be a fissure, there will be a juncture, there will be a kind of discontinuity and fragmentation within it. And then there are a couple of lines which talk about the rituals that go on. The date or place pointing west. When the soul rises, it will work into the golden east, into the house of the sun. So there is this belief that the date are always pointed because sun is born every day and it dies every day. Okay, so that is the kind of tribal belief that is being talked about here. So the sun is born every morning as a kind of as a child, and then it travels, and then the old sun dies at the end of the day behind the mountain, and the mountain is a witness to the birth and the death of the sun every day. So when these people are kind of lied down with their head pointing to the west, there is a direct corollary between the life and the death of the sun and the life and the death of human being. So from being born, living, and from being born and dying in this world, the soul will now become a part of the immortal by being born with the sun and dying with it at the end of the day. In the cool bamboo, restored in sunlight, life matters like this. And when that same light will come back to the bamboo houses on the living, then the ancestors who have departed and joined the sun will also join them in the form of a sunlight, because sun in its body has already embedded these people. So in the cool bamboo, restored in sunlight, maybe the bamboo hut is restored in sunlight after the dark night, or it may be that the living over here after its death has been restored in life in the sun, and the light that is emitting from it, life matters like this. In small towns by the river, we all want to walk with the gods. So gods here is not something that is a far away being. The divinity that Walcott was speaking in the last poem, a kind of untouchable, a kind of, I would say, a kind of unfathomable divinity, but God as something with which we become one after death and thereby become God. So God is the kind of potential to immortality that we all as human beings entertain, which is something which is the kind of belief system that Dai is talking about and is lyrically presenting in front of us. Right? So I think that is the way that these poems can be read. Thank you. I think that's it. And if there are other questions, we can kind of entertain them in the course of future part. Thank you, Malika. I think, yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Ariktam. You have explained the poems beautifully. I would request you to please stay for the question and answer session. I would now request
Yeah,
Bashobi to quickly take up the questions for the speakers. Bashobi, are you there? Yes. Please take up the questions
Thanks
for
to
the
our
speakers.
honorable speakers for such brilliantly enriching talk. Thanks for sharing your valuable knowledge, time, and expertise with us. Now we will proceed towards question answer session. Our students have written their questions in the comment box. Many questions have been asked. As we are running short in time, I will read some questions from the comment box. So now question is for our first speaker, Professor Shaswat Panda. Question has been asked by Tamokla Mukherjee, a student of semester 5 from our department. His question is, what is the significance of Jack Naka's terminology, the other, which was also used by Edward Said in the arena of postcolonialism? Professor Panda,
Okay.
over to you.
Yes. I got the question. Um, See, this term, the other, actually has a very long history, which I'm sure some of us must be already aware. I mean, first of all, thank you, Tamogna Mukherjee, for the question. Uh, the word other, actually, it could have two meanings depending on whether the O is in lowercase or the O is in uppercase. I presume here the O is in uppercase, based on what I can see. So if we are talking about the O in lowercase in the context of colonialism, it refers to those who are marginalized, those whose voices are not really heard. And this is drawing upon Lacan's idea of the child looking at itself in the mirror stage. What the child sees in the mirror is like itself, but it tries to look for the differences based on which the ego is shaped. That's what Lacan says. This is psychoanalysis. In the context of colonialism, the O in the lowercase is the colonized, who's constantly struggling to define itself. When we come to the O in uppercase, which like I said, I think is what he means, the O refers essentially to the figure of the colonizer, whose validation, whose approval is what the colonized subject always seeks. And the colonized subject's way of looking at the world, if we might want to use the word ideology, is based on or is shaped by the ideology of the colonizer. So the other, with a capital O, as excuse me, referred to in a colonial context, refers to the colonizer, whose worldview becomes the worldview of the colonized subject.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Panda. Now, next question is also for you. That question has been asked by Shobata Dey, a student of semester 6 of our department. His question is, do you think that the theory of nationalism is just a way to counter the fake narratives of colonial rulers? Or will you say that nationalism is again a narrow and biased way in this context? Please,
Um, uh,
over.
Thank you, Shogata, for the question. It's a very important question, actually. I think there are so many aspects to nationalism, there are so many shades of nationalism, that it may not be right. It won't be fair to say either nationalism is this or that. There are various forms and there are various models of nationalism. While it is true that nationalism was, uh, the way it emerged, I mean, a lot of it, when it came to India, much of it was borrowed from the West, and that's a view which has been famously offered by Benedict Anderson in his book Imagined Communities, that a nation is something which is imagined into existence, and it's an idea which comes from Europe, which is imported from Europe. And the critique of Benedict Anderson's idea of nationalism can be found in Partha Chatterjee's book, Whose Imagined Community, that particular essay. So what Partha Chatterjee says is that nationalism was not something which was just borrowed whole scale or was imported whole scale to India from Europe. The Indian model of nationalism was premised on the idea of difference. So set of binaries, what Europeans or the English are and what Indians are not, and so on and so forth. So these are, I mean, and there are several other models and ideas of nationalism that we are told. These are theoretical concepts. Having said that, if you look at the way nationalism operates, or if you look at the kind of things nationalism achieves, it may not always be narrow-minded or biased. I mean, one has to be wary of the fact that sometimes nationalism can be deployed as a way of excluding others, of separating one group more often than not, majority from minority, and so on. In our times, we see it more than anywhere else. The whole issue with migrants and so on. So that is there. So that one problem is there. That there are similar issues. But at the same time, if we look at most of the anti-colonial struggles were more or less nationalist in character, because unless people had not been united, unless they had not been brought under a single banner, made to think that they belong to some common category, you may call it imagined or whatever, it perhaps would not have been possible to bring so many people together. And I at this point, I would like to recall what Benedict Anderson had to say towards the later part of his life, when he said that I never meant that nationalism was by and large a very bad thing. There were aspects to nationalism which were very important and which played a very important role in driving colonial forces out of the countries which were under colonial rule, were under imperial rule for a very long time. So depending on how nationalism is deployed, what the narrative does, you could say. So it cannot just be countering the fake narratives of colonial rule, or it does not necessarily, or it does not only have to be a sign of jingoism or narrow-mindedness and so on and so forth. So many people unite. The whole anti-colonial struggle was more or less based on nationalism. So there are various aspects to nationalism. One can't really straitjacket it and say that it's bad or good, so on and so forth. Am I audible?
Bashobi, can you hear me?
For our another speaker, Dr.
Can we bring in Ariktam da, please? There is a question for Ariktam da.
বলো অম্বালিকা, বলো।
হ্যাঁ Derek Walcott, তোমার জন্য question আছে. Derek Walcott has argued that the migrants often possess a double consciousness, a leftover native one and a first world one. What is the effect of such double consciousness in post-colonial poetry?
See, there are, I would try to answer it in a different way. See, the thing is that if, first of all, what Derek Walcott generally implies by double consciousness among migrants is something that is more pertaining to a kind of the Caribbean situation that he talks about here. where the First World, the French, the Creole, the African migrants all live in a kind of liminal space on the margin, or where many semiospheres are coming in touch with one another. And the margin, as almost all post-colonial theorists as well as semioticians have argued, is the most creative and the most bubbling and the most place where most of the things happen. Then if that is what it is, then of course there's a lot of that in post-colonial poetry. Although I am still suspect, as I said in the beginning of my lecture, that of post-colonial poetry as a kind of category with common traits in all of it. It's not like that at all. I think the 2 points that we read illustrated that amply. But I am also a little skeptic of the way in which the word consciousness has been used over the years. কনসিয়াসনেসকে নানাভাবে পড়া যায়, মানে আমি বলছি যে ধরো আমার পূর্বপুরুষ তারা বাংলাদেশ থেকে এসেছিল, তারা মাইগ্রেন্ট, তারা ফার্স্ট ওয়ার্ল্ডে যায়নি। তাকে যদি আমার দাদুকে যদি বলা হতো যে আপনার কি দুটি চেতনা আছে, তাহলে সে আকাশ থেকে পড়ত। যে কনসিয়াসনেস তো একটাই, মানুষের একটা চেতনার নানাবিধ পরত থাকতে পারে। কিন্তু আমি যদি কনসিয়াসনেসকে এইভাবে পড়ি যে সেটার মানে হচ্ছে সত্তা, যে তার ভেতরে অনেকগুলো বিরোধাভাস কোএক্সিস্ট করতে পারে, তাহলে আমি বলবো সেটা আছে। মানে এটা তো বলতে লাগে না, একটা মানুষ মাইগ্রেট করছে মানে তার ফেলে আসা জায়গাটা একটা জায়গা তৈরি হচ্ছে যেটার সাথে মেমোরির একটা যোগ আছে, যে জায়গাটার সাথে রিয়েল জায়গাটার একটা ডিসপ্লেসমেন্ট হচ্ছে সেটা সবসময় একটা মেমোরি হয়ে যাচ্ছে। আর একটা তো রিয়েল ইনহ্যাবিটেড প্লেস, এবং সবসময় তার প্রত্যেকটা আটারেন্স ক্রিয়েটিভ আটারেন্স সবসময় দুটোর মার্জিনে হচ্ছে। ওয়ালকটের ক্ষেত্রে যেটা স্পেসিফিক, এবং সেটা প্রায় সমস্ত পোস্ট কলোনিয়াল পোয়েট্রির ক্ষেত্রে এক্সটেন্ড নাও করা যেতে পারে, সেটা হচ্ছে ক্যারিবিয়ান সিচুয়েশনটার ইউনিকনেস। সেটা শুধুমাত্র আফ্রিকা থেকে ফার্স্ট ওয়ার্ল্ডে আসলো বা এরকম নয়, সেখানে আরো অনেকগুলো ইনফ্লুয়েন্স একটা আরেকটার সাথে থাকলো, আর ক্রিয়েটিভ আটারেন্স গুলো তার মার্জিনে হতে থাকলো, সেটা একরকম। কিন্তু এটাকে আবার একইভাবে জেনারেলাইজ করে আমরা সব রকমের ডায়াসপোরা বা মাইগ্রেন্ট ন্যারেটিভের ক্ষেত্রে জেনারেলাইজও করতে পারি। আমার মনে হয় আমরা যদি এই স্পেসিফিসিটি গুলো খেয়াল রাখি, তাহলে আমাদের লিটারেচার বোঝার ক্ষেত্রে খানিকটা সুবিধা। I think that is the way I would like to answer your question very brief, because I think time is short. Yes, Ambalika. If that answers it, is that okay?
Thank you, Ariktam. So another question is for you, that is again asked by Tomokno. What is the significance of incorporating calypso, reggae, dub and creole in post-colonial Caribbean poetry? Over to you, Ariktam.
See, I think I have partially answered your question, right? Already. The situation is that the situation in West Indies is such that it is a kind that Walcott himself, and not Walcott, many other Caribbean creative people, singers, musicians, poets, creative writers, even thinkers, they're all operating at a kind of space where multiple semiospheres are operating side by side one another. So, if your question is that, what was the question, Bashobi? What was the early part of the question? Can you just repeat it once more? That what is just the first part of it? Yeah, the significance. I think it is significant.
Of incorporating?
Yeah, it is significant. It depends on the way you are meaning significance, actually. If you want to mean significance as if its importance, relevance, then we are no one to comment on that. Every creative person, if he is incorporating something as a part of his creative output, that has to be relevant, sui generis, as a part of it for that creative person. Okay, we can only experience that and analyze that. But if you're trying to mean significance as related to science, as a signum, then I think that yes, it is operating at a kind of conversion of multiple science system. So that way it is significant too. So yes, it is significant. The significance is there, and the significance is obvious. I think there's nothing to say about it much.
Yes, thank you, Ariktam. And
thanks for the question, though. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah.
Yes, and thanking you all, we will end the question and answer session. And now over to you, Professor Rabindra Mahavidyalaya.
Now, dear hostess, may I say something? May I say something? Just asking for the permission from the coordinators and the hostess. May I add something? Am I audible basically?
Yes, sir, is here.
Yes, you're audible. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just adding a thing or two. If I do not already trample upon the kind of remarkable patience that we have all been witness to. I mean, it's a kind of a collective endeavor on all our part. I'm including the learned speakers as well, and running the risk of once again uh, leaving my listeners and viewers rather bored to the bones. Uh, just let me allow one occasion as a kind of a wrapping up move to go back to the kind of original contention with which I tried to begin this present session. This has been wonderfully both of an inauguration and an elaboration of the basic tenets that go into making the highly larded and theoretically rather intricate field of postcolonialism. And thanks to Shaswat for doing that. And finally, it is Ariktam who dealt with the specific examples of literary texts. Here, the postcolonial poetry of so many eminent ones, including Derek Walcott, that ultimately get us back to the kind of perpetuation that we have been talking about in our own different ways. Uh, the point is, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement was the first notable occasion, I would rather say, when voices of the margins at the time of the country's uh, start as an independent nation, it found a kind of full-throated expression, especially from those. Uh, and I would rather add that this is rather a logical culmination in the Ram temple being a metaphor which is now being reconstructed in Ayodhya, uh, which basically tend to accommodate voices from that were marginalized by decades of exclusion. Once again, I am not trying to deal with the rightness or the wrongness of the whole thing. I'm just using it as as a way of analyzing and having an understanding, broad understanding of how post-colonialism still operates. And the other 3 decades, uh, I'm sorry, over the time, this has sharpened into a kind of straightforward repudiation of what Nehru and the other founding fathers really stood for. Uh, like Erdogan's Islamism, this is currently not a vision for the future. I repeat, this is not a vision for the future, but a disowning, a conscious disowning of India's immediate past while harking back to a time a bit further back in the past, I would rather suggest, which is perceived as something very glorious. Now, going back to the past and retrieving something which is deemed to be glorious historically and culturally has been a part of the post-colonial reaction, and how this is now taking on an almost new kind of an avatar. How new things are daily being injected, how the common ideas are being reinvested by newer kinds of significance and meaning that basically come under our present scrutiny and analysis. And basically, my point is what Kemal Ataturk and Nehru were trying to do was unoriginal. And what the Erdogan government and the present political dispensation at the center are trying to do with the Ram Temple are equally startlingly unoriginal, because it smacks of a kind of bias, the meaning of which we can always derive from our learning, from our understanding of the post-colonial ways of life, the way it is being lived. And thanks, Shaswat, for giving us a kind of an overview of the things that basically are deemed as fundamental for a broader understanding of the post-colonial thing. Just one or two points. This is not in terms of a question, but just an addendum. I mean, when we are talking about settlement and the kind of settlements that were made over the years and decades, I'm really struck by or we already know this, I mean, the kind of reverse colonialism that has taken place after the colonies, the former colonies declared their own kind of freedom, and how it led to a kind of, at least an attempt, a sort of attempt on the part of the political establishment over there in the place to accommodate this kind of dissenting voice and garb it in the rather acceptable terms of multiculturalism. So the West has to come to this pass and accept that multiculturalism is the kind of thing which is going to stay, at least for some time now. And then I'm just, going from one thing to the other, not trying to maintain any kind of a logical sequence. Ariktam has been quite succinct in his presentation. And he has been talking about not only a famous example through the poetry of Derek Walcott, but he was also suggesting of a poet from Arunachal. And Arunachal, I would rather say, is a kind of a state or belongs to that part of the northeast of India, which even during the time of the imperial sway had been rather doubly, or rather I should say trebly or multiply, in fact, subjugated by the British hegemonic power, by the political establishment. And only someone from Arunachal, but even think of a poet like Nissim Ezekiel, who very much belongs to the center, the Indian center, because he mostly lived his life in Bombay. I mean, even in case of Ezekiel, most of his poems are, or majority of them carry a kind of an autobiographical streak, where he kept on telling time and again about his own problematic understanding and an effort on his part, continual effort on his part, to come to terms with his troubled identity. He had been a Jew, though he is an Indian, and he often says that he felt like a natural outsider in a country called India, though he often ended up asserting and suggesting that ultimately he finds his roots in this country called India, and he would best describe his own kind of an identity and his own rootedness in terms of this nativism. So I'm sorry for all these things, but I just couldn't quite shake myself. I just rise up to a kind of a temptation, because the presentations has been so enlightening for us. And thank you once again to my dear speakers for really, taking a good effort in sizing up their own kind of presentation so that it conform particularly to the sort of rubric which basically is the kind of line of thinking or discussion that we intend to adopt for this present seminar of ours. So thank you very much once again. And before the Thanksgiving starts, I really thank my department for putting in so much of effective labor and putting up such a fine show for us. And last but not the least, I mean, Robiul has been quite at it once again, being the convener of the IT subcommittee, and especially Pronovi. She has been keeping a bit low for the last couple of months, and I just only recently came to know that she has her sister-in-law back in home who is terminally ill, and for some reason or the other, the condition has aggravated. So this, even in this present exacerbated, troubled domestic space, she has managed to come and host the whole thing for us. So as principal, it's my duty to extend a kind of a thanks to her. And I'm sorry once again for trampling on the patience of the others, including my other listeners, and especially the dear students who are not visible on screen, but I know they are very much over there. So over to the hostess.
Thank you, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you for winding it up beautifully. Now I would ask Shomadi to please deliver the vote of thanks. Shomadi, over to you.
On behalf of our college authorities, and especially our principal, Sir Dr. Prasanta Bhattacharyya, I convey my heartfelt gratitude to our honorable dignitaries, Dr. Ariktam Chatterjee and Professor Shaswat Panda, for taking out their times to share their valuable knowledge on post-colonialism, focusing precisely on post-colonial poetry and the growth and scope of this period in the history of English literature and language. But beside the speakers, there are so many other people whose invisible cooperation has made this webinar fruitful. Among them, at the very first, I would like to thank to our Honorable Principal Sir, Dr. Prasanta Bhattacharyya, whose continuous support and encouragement inspired us to make this webinar possible. I thank to Professor Tanmay Bandyopadhyay, the IQAC coordinator of our college. I want to convey my thanks to our HOD and the joint convener of this webinar, Professor Basubipal, and I also thank Professor Ambalika Bishwas, the convener of this webinar. The tireless efforts and cooperation of these two sincere ladies of our department have made our dreams come true. I thank to all the students of our college and also the other participants who have joined our webinar from the various parts of our country. I heartily acknowledge each of the alumnus whose presence makes this webinar even more colorful. I thank you all for hearing us so attentively. I also thank to Dr. Robiul Alam, the whole IT committee of our college, and especially Dr. Pranavi Porel for conducting this webinar successfully. Without their assistance, this webinar would not have been successful. Now, as we have come to the end of this webinar, special lecture series number 1, I shall like to conclude it referring a beautiful quotation of Barney Siegel. As he says, peace of mind do protect us. They allow us to overcome the problems that life hands us. They teach us to survive, to live now, to have the courage to confront each day. We, all the staffs of Rabindra Mahavidyalaya, Champadanga, Hooghly, also are wishing the peace of mind, safety, and the good health of everybody present here in these tough times. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay peaceful. Thanks to you all.